This morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released the Consumer Price Index report for October 2026. The number appeared on screens across trading floors, newsrooms, and government offices simultaneously. 13.2%. Year-over-year inflation had reached 13.2%, the highest rate recorded since 1982, when the American economy was still recovering from the oil shocks and stagflation of the previous decade. Within seconds, markets began to move. Stock futures fell. Bond yields spiked. Currency traders dumped dollars. The economic consequences of the Iran conflict, which had been building for months, had just become undeniable. The inflation number was not a surprise to economists who had been tracking prices closely. What made it significant was the official confirmation and the breadth of the increase. This was not inflation confined to a single sector or driven by a temporary disruption. It was comprehensive, persistent, and accelerating. Energy prices were the most visible component. Gasoline, which had averaged $3.50 per gallon in October 2025, now cost $10.20 per gallon nationally. In California, the price had reached $13.50. In Hawaii, $14.20. Even in Texas, historically a low-cost state for fuel, prices had climbed to $9.40 per gallon. The proximate cause was clear. Brent crude oil, the international benchmark, was trading at $152 per barrel, having risen from $85 per barrel before Iran destroyed its own oil infrastructure. The removal of 2.5 million barrels per day from global supply, combined with the depletion of the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve, had created a supply shortage that no amount of increased production from other sources could offset in the short term. OPEC was producing at capacity. American shale producers were drilling as quickly as possible, but the lag time between drilling and production meant relief was months away. Energy prices fed through to every other sector of the economy. Transportation costs soared, driving up the price of any good that needed to be moved from factory to warehouse to store. Food prices increased 18% year over year as farmers faced higher costs for fuel, fertilizer, and transportation. A gallon of milk that cost $4.20 a year earlier now cost $5.80. A loaf of bread had gone from $3.20 to $4.50. A dozen eggs cost $6.20, up from $4.50. Ground beef, chicken, fresh produce, everything was significantly more expensive. The impact on household budgets was immediate and severe. A family of four spending $280 per week on groceries a year earlier was now spending $330 per week for the same items, an increase of $50 weekly or $2,600 annually. Combined with the increase in gasoline costs, utility bills, and other expenses tied to energy prices, the average American household was spending thousands of dollars more per year just to maintain the same standard of living. Wages had not kept pace. Average hourly earnings had increased 5.2% over the past year, a respectable gain in normal times, but wholly inadequate when inflation was running at 13.2%. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, had fallen 8%. Workers were earning more in nominal terms, but could afford less. Purchasing power was eroding, and the erosion was accelerating. The wage price spiral that economists had warned about for months was now in motion. Workers, seeing their paychecks buy less each month, demanded raises to keep up with inflation. Unions in industries with collective bargaining power were asking for 15 to 20% wage increases. Employers, already struggling with compressed profit margins as their own costs increased, faced an impossible choice. Grant the raises and pass costs to customers, driving prices higher and perpetuating inflation. Or refuse the raises and face strikes, labor shortages, and reduced productivity. Many chose the former, and prices continued to climb. The Federal Reserve, the institution responsible for maintaining price stability, faced a dilemma that had no good solution. The textbook response to high inflation is to raise interest rates. Higher rates make borrowing more expensive, which slows economic activity, reduces demand, and eventually brings prices down. But the economy was already slowing. GDP growth in the third quarter had been just 0.4%, down from 1.8% in the first quarter. Unemployment had risen from 4.2% at the beginning of the year to 5.8% in October and was projected to reach 7% by mid-2027. Raising interest rates in this environment would push the economy into recession, possibly a severe one. Businesses already struggling with high costs and weakening demand would cut investment and lay off workers. Consumer spending, which accounts for 70% of US GDP, would contract as households faced higher borrowing costs and job insecurity. The recession would be deeper and longer than necessary. But not raising rates meant accepting that inflation would continue unchecked. 13% inflation was already eroding savings, destroying fixed-income investments, and creating political turmoil. If it accelerated to 15 or 18%, the economic and social consequences would be catastrophic. The Federal Reserve was trapped between triggering a recession and allowing runaway inflation. At its most recent meeting, the Fed had chosen to hold interest rates at 5.25%, issuing a statement that it was monitoring the situation closely. The reality was that policymakers had no good options and were hoping the problem would resolve itself. It would not. The combination of high inflation, low growth, and rising unemployment had a name: stagflation. The United States had experienced it in the 1970s, following oil shocks and the end of the Bretton Woods monetary system. That episode had lasted nearly a decade and required extraordinarily painful measures to resolve. Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker had raised interest rates above 20% in the early 1980s, deliberately inducing a severe recession to break the back of inflation. Unemployment reached double digits. Businesses failed. Families lost homes. But inflation was eventually brought under control. The current situation was in some ways worse. The 1970s stagflation had been primarily a domestic phenomenon, driven by policy mistakes and external oil shocks that were eventually resolved through diplomacy. The current crisis was tied to an ongoing war with no clear end in sight. Iran had deliberately destroyed its oil infrastructure as a strategic move to inflict economic pain on the United States and its allies. As long as the war continued, the oil supply shortage would persist, and energy prices would remain elevated. Consumer confidence, measured by surveys of household sentiment about the economy, had collapsed. The index stood at 62, down from 98 at the beginning of the year, and the lowest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Americans were deeply pessimistic about their economic prospects, and that pessimism was translating into behavior. Spending on discretionary items had fallen sharply. Retail sales were down 18% in inflation-adjusted terms. Restaurants, already operating on thin margins, were closing as customers stopped dining out. Major retailers were announcing layoffs and store closures. Small businesses were suffering disproportionately. Bankruptcy filings among small firms had increased 34% year over year. Many could not pass rising costs to customers without losing business entirely. Those that tried found that customers simply stopped buying. The result was a wave of closures that was eliminating jobs and reducing competition in local markets. The stock market reflected the economic distress. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was down 22% from its January peak. The S&P 500 had fallen 26%. The NASDAQ, heavy with technology stocks, was down 31%. This was a bear market by any definition, and it was erasing household wealth at an alarming rate. The average 401k retirement account had lost $47,000 in value. For Americans in their 50s and 60s planning to retire in the next decade, the losses were devastating. Many were postponing retirement, hoping the market would recover before they needed to draw on their savings. The housing market, a critical component of middle-class wealth, was also in turmoil. Mortgage rates had climbed to 8.2% from 6.8% at the start of the year, as lenders demanded higher rates to compensate for inflation risk. At those rates, monthly payments on a median-priced home were unaffordable for most buyers. Home sales had plummeted 28%. New construction was down 31%. Prices, which had been rising for years, were finally starting to fall as sellers confronted a market with few buyers. Politically, the economic crisis was creating intense pressure on elected officials. Midterm elections were 3 days away. Polling showed the incumbent party trailing by 12 percentage points, an enormous deficit driven almost entirely by voter dissatisfaction with the economy. Campaign ads hammered a simple message. Gas costs $10 per gallon, groceries cost 18% more, and your paycheck buys less every month. The war in Iran was costing billions while families struggled to pay bills. Protests had become a regular feature of urban life. Demonstrations with signs reading "We can't afford to live" and "End the war, we're suffering" filled city streets every weekend. The protesters were not radicals or fringe groups. They were ordinary people, parents, workers, retirees, who were being crushed by inflation and saw no end in sight. Food bank lines were growing longer. Charitable organizations reported that families who had never needed assistance were now asking for help. The stories were everywhere. A couple in their 30s with 2 young children, both working full-time jobs, using credit cards to pay for groceries because their paychecks no longer covered basic expenses. A retiree choosing between prescription medications and heating oil as winter approached. A small business owner closing a shop that had been in the family for 2 generations because customers stopped coming and costs kept rising. These were not abstractions. They were the lived reality of millions of Americans. Iran's strategy, which had seemed self-destructive when it began, was now looking calculated. Iranian leaders had concluded that their own economy was already ruined by sanctions and that they had nothing to lose by destroying oil infrastructure. But the West, particularly the United States, had everything to lose. Democratic governments are vulnerable to public pressure in ways that authoritarian regimes are not. An Iranian government could endure hardship indefinitely, suppressing dissent and controlling narratives through state media. An American government facing elections every 2 years could not. The economic pain was translating into political demands for peace. Congressional offices were flooded with calls and emails from constituents asking why the war was continuing when they could barely afford to drive to work or buy food for their families. The calculation in Tehran was that this pressure would eventually force Washington to negotiate on terms favorable to Iran. And that calculation was proving correct. After the midterm elections, which were expected to result in significant losses for the party in power, the new Congress would almost certainly force a debate on the war. Authorization votes that had passed narrowly at the beginning of the conflict would fail if brought to the floor again. The political will to continue fighting was evaporating as the economic costs mounted. Internationally, the United States was not alone in its suffering. European economies were also experiencing high inflation, driven by energy costs that had surged due to both the loss of Russian natural gas and the loss of Iranian oil. Europe had entered recession months earlier. China, less dependent on Middle Eastern oil, was managing better with inflation at 4.1%, but even their growth had slowed. The global economy was in synchronized decline, and the Iran conflict was a major contributing factor. The Federal Reserve's next meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks after the midterm elections. Markets were watching closely to see if the Fed would finally raise rates aggressively to combat inflation, or continue to hold steady out of fear of triggering a deeper recession. Some analysts argued that the Fed had waited too long and that inflation was now embedded in expectations. Workers expected prices to keep rising, so they demanded higher wages. Businesses expected costs to keep increasing, so they raised prices preemptively. Breaking that cycle would require a shock, a dramatic increase in interest rates that would impose immediate pain but might restore credibility. Others argued that the Fed should focus on the supply side. The inflation was primarily driven by energy prices, which were a function of the war. Monetary policy could not drill more oil wells or rebuild Iranian refineries. The solution had to be diplomatic, not economic. End the conflict, restore oil supplies, and inflation would moderate on its own. The debate was academic. The Fed had limited tools and faced political constraints. The White House did not want a recession before or after the elections. Congress did not want unemployment to rise further, and the public wanted relief from inflation without the pain of higher interest rates. These demands were incompatible, and policymakers were paralyzed by the impossibility of satisfying them all. The October inflation report was a milestone, but it was not the endpoint. Forecasters projected that inflation would remain elevated through the winter and possibly into the following year. Energy demand would increase as heating season began. Food prices would continue rising as higher input costs worked through the supply chain. Rent increases, which lagged other components of inflation, were still catching up to the surge in housing costs from earlier in the year. The economic battlefield had become as consequential as the military one. Iran had not defeated American forces in direct combat. It had not sunk a carrier or overrun a base, but it had imposed costs that were politically unsustainable. 13.2% inflation, $10 gasoline, families unable to afford groceries, retirement accounts decimated, a recession looming, and a Federal Reserve with no good options. The reckoning had arrived. The war had been framed as a matter of national security, regional stability, and deterrence of aggression. But for most Americans, it was now a matter of personal economic survival. And survival was becoming harder every day.